Hey, I think we can go ahead and get started. If you all haven't done so already, please do share your name, organization, where you're joining from today in the chat. But welcome. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. My name is Neha Javeri, and together with Stephanie Martin, who is a faculty member at University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, we co-facilitate the Family Inclusion in Nutrition through Engagement Community of Practice, or the FINE COP for short. Today's meeting will be focused on engaging family members within the food environment. So the agenda is as follows. We'll have two presentations today. Our first speaker will share a new family dynamics food environment framework, which expands the concept of the food environment to include family dynamics. Then we will move into our next presentation, which is on an innovative approach to social marketing of nutritious foods in Burkina Faso that engages mother-in-laws as key change agents. I will have a very, very brief pause for very quick clarifying questions before we are hoping to move into some smaller groups for in-depth discussion. Then we'll come back together as a large group, share out slightly, and then we'll close. And we do have French interpretation for today's meeting. For those of you who would like to access, there should be an interpretation button on the bottom right-hand side of your Zoom window. And please go ahead and select French, and then you have the option to also mute the original audio. And I put the instructions in French for those of you who would like to do that. And the purpose of the FINE COP, for those of you who are new here today, and to remind those who have been with us for quite some time, is to facilitate dialogue, learning, and resource sharing among those who support and are involved in family engagement in nutrition programs, and also building connection among those who are involved in this work. So there are a few ways you can learn more. We do have a website that we'll share the link to in the chat very shortly. That has an overview of the community practice. We do have a YouTube channel, which is currently hosting all of the previous meeting recordings, and this one will be up there as well shortly. And then we have a listserv. On the listserv, we announce our upcoming meetings with the registration links. We share the materials from the meetings that we have had. We also ask those who are members to share any relevant resources that they may have or pose any questions to this community. And again, in the chat, we will share a Google form that allows you to share your information. And please do pass it on to anyone else who you think would be interested in doing so. And now I will turn it over to Lisa to introduce our speakers for today.
Thank you so much, Neha. We are so thrilled to have two very distinguished research and program experts in engaging families in nutrition, focusing on food systems today, a really new and exciting topic for us. So Dr. Ramya Ambikapathi is a senior research associate in the Cornell CAL's Department of Global Development. Her research broadly focuses on how environmental and ecological factors translate to poor nutrition outcomes and efforts to mitigate these negative impacts. Her research has led her to explore gender equity, men's engagement, family food choices, food environment, informal economy, food systems, and also metrics and methods to measure these complex factors as they relate to nutrition outcomes. She has led the DECIDE study, a Drivers of Food Choice grant, exploring family food environments, family diets, and informal food environments in urban Tanzania. So we're excited to hear about her new paper and thinking on this topic. And on the program side, we are delighted to welcome Tégwendé Charles Edouard Kabore. He currently serves as the Director of Nutrition at the USAID YIDGIRI project led by CNFA. He has a decade of experience in food security and nutrition. In his current role, he leads a talented team focusing on delivering innovative programs that empower communities and fostering partnerships to create sustainable change. His approach emphasizes evidence-based interventions and active community engagement to ensure culturally relevant and effective initiatives. He holds advanced degrees in public health and nutrition and continues to advocate for nutrition as a fundamental component of health and well-being, contributing to a future where everyone has the opportunity to thrive. Thank you so much, and back to you, Neha.
Thank you so much. And without further ado, I can turn it over to Ramya to begin. Thank you again for joining us today.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for the lovely introduction and the invitation to present here. So today I'll be presenting on this framework that we put together, that we developed from an existing framework. And it's basically expanding how to include the current food environment models to include family dynamics. And this was part of the DECIDE study, the drivers of food choice, which I'll talk a little bit later. Next slide, please. This is our team. So I'm from Cornell University. My co-first author is also Morgan Bodensek, who's a PhD student at University of South Carolina. And my other colleagues, Nilupa, Germana, Sunita, Bafai, and Crystal, some of them are here. I'm really thrilled. They have contributed extensively, and it's really it's been a project for like 3 or 4 years. But I just wanted to say thank you for the contribution and the continued contribution as well. Next slide, please. So there's been a tremendous interest, at least I'm sure in this community, but focusing on food environments. We want to focus on the food environments because we're facing enormous multiple huge burdens of diseases, have a dietary risk factor, food environments where people procure and make decisions about food choice and purchasing. Those patterns are like increasingly thought of as a big entry point to shape those diets. In 80% of the food in Africa and rest of most of the world is bought. Even in rural areas, households are net buyers. So I'll focus a lot in the context of African setting and some in Asian setting, because that's where the food environments are rapidly changing. Next slide, please. We focused particularly on HIV for multiple reasons. One DECIDE study was aiming to look at characterizing internal, external food environment using among people living with HIV with a gender and a family lens. Besides, in addition to the study aim, we wanted to focus on HIV because that was a chronic disease. It's now thought of as a chronic disease like diabetes and cardiovascular diseases. Historically, food has been used as an important mediator and as a medicine to improve outcomes, especially with HIV treatment and adherence to treatment. In terms of family context, like why, when you think about why family context is important, families are often the first place where people disclose their status, household food security, tons of literature in the last few decades talking about how that's a very critical component to mitigate adverse outcomes. Spousal dynamics, the co-infections, treatments, those are all very much related, especially within the family. And then huge literature on how family caregiving really improves treatment, adherence, and other health outcomes. And then families also purchase meals, they pool meals, share meals, accommodate each other's dietary preferences. Here I'm saying family, but it's not just in terms of like the normative Western family, it could be also kinship, any family members who are in a place that have kinship networks, but are also sharing food and meals. The biggest challenge right now with HIV is that there's a growing syndemic. So like there's a treatment-related dyslipidemia that really increases your higher risk, puts you at a higher risk for cardiovascular diseases. And especially in a changing food environment, it's really has this negative synergistic effect on health outcomes. So some of the HIV, the burden of non-communicable diseases in HIV population can be higher even compared to the general population, just because there's a heightened risk factors there. Next slide, please. So food environment, how and why people choose food is increasingly recognized, and we wanted to study in the context of HIV and other comorbidities, but HIV itself is a chronic disease, or thought of as a chronic disease. And then the whole aim of this this research was to understand how family dynamics influences food choice in HIV-affected households. This is part of the larger DECIDE drivers of food choice study, where we aim to examine external, internal food environments using a gender and a family lens. So this was one of the big outcome of the study. Next slide, please. Oh, thank you. Thank you for adding and Lisa has added the link to the paper there. And I'll quickly go through this so we have more time to actually discuss the content and the findings. We used a method called qualitative evidence synthesis, which is basically a systematic review of qualitative studies. And we can think of like the studies as a transcript itself. So each paper would be a data transcript. And we used best fit framework synthesis approach, which basically tests or expands an existing framework. So for this, we used the Turner Food Environment Framework and the Giddens structuration theory, and I'll talk a little bit about that. And then there were three main codes. When we got the papers, we either coded them as external, personal, or family. They could have multiple. And then for here, I'm just, for the purposes of this paper, it just focuses on the family, food, environment factors. Next slide, please. So this is a sort of classic model, which is now considered classic. It came out 5-6 years ago, Turner Food Environment Model. There's two sort of domains, the external food environment, which has these subdomains on prices, availability, vendor product properties, and marketing. And then the personal food environment, which is about affordability, desirability, accessibility, and convenience. So when you look at this, the external, which is a bit out of the control of within the family or within the personal, what's missing is the sort of family dynamics. So what we wanted to do was just sort of expand it and understand what are the factors that are between personal and external that mediate health outcomes, dietary and health outcomes. Next slide, please. So Giddens structuration theory is basically saying that there's a structure and agency. Agency is choice. So individuals have choices. So the personal food preferences, you prefer this based on your mood or life stages or whatever it is, whatever you can afford, you have a variety of choices. And then it's structured by this sort of external and other environments, the prices that people said, what's available in your neighborhoods. So what we did was that we wanted to use the structuration theory, which is the interaction between the structures and then the agency, the choice. So the idea is that these two interact to form like your food habits, your behavioral routines. And it's a very flexible theory where like over a period of time, it could actually could actually change. So if there is changes in diagnosis of diseases with migration, changes in the food environment, you move to a different place, you still have your preferences, your choice, but then now it's being structured by a new place or new disease or new time or new member of the family. So it's a very flexible theory that basically says looks at the interaction of the choice and the structures around us. And then for the purpose of this paper, we kind of called family structures, like the social values, the traditions, the actual composition as a medium for as a placeholder for structure. And this over a period of time forms your dietary patterns, your behaviors, your status, nutrition status, and health outcomes. Next slide, please. So we searched for a variety of keywords, and then we also in 3 databases, and then we also did a quality appraisal of the papers. Overall, they were pretty good. I'll just tell you, you're happy to look at individual criteria in the paper supplementary materials. From 6,000 articles, we ended up with 138 articles that we included in the review. This protocol was registered in Prospero. Next slide, please. Overall, the 138 studies, they predominantly come from the Eastern to Southern African settings. So a lot of the examples that I put out there will be from there, with a few from Asia and China and Southeast Asia. Next slide, please. So without further ado, what we came up with is the sort of three main dimensions within the family structure. So there was family resources, family characteristics, and action-oriented. Those were all balanced by or changed or shaped by the health context. So family resources, next slide, please. Family resources refers to social capital, resource allocation, how we pool, straddle, with time use, fuel, and water. And this is something that I think everybody was familiar with, not having enough time. And this is a great quote from one of the papers that we included, talks about how time is somehow shortened because they now have to care for another sick person. They have to return, they have to have, they have to make meals at every proper hours so the person with HIV could take their medication. So this is in the context of HIV, but this is also relevant to others as well. One of the big things that was very persistent was time use. It's not just about one person within the family. It's also about, the time use through the schools, time use where the kids go to the school. When women started working, and this is when you see like how nutrition transition is so gendered. It's when women don't have time to purchase and cook, the availability of convenience food, and really shape that gender nutrition transition that we saw in the last few decades. So time use is something very global and universal, and in particularly because of the medication, because of those special adherence, it just somehow felt more shortened. Next slide, please. And the next dimension was family characteristics. This was about family size, compositions, age, generation, and comorbidities. Increasingly, what we're seeing, at least there, people don't just have HIV, they might have other comorbidities with mental health or non-communicable diseases, but there's also people who don't have HIV that also would have comorbidities. So it's not just one person in the family, multiple folks in the family could also affect your food choice pattern. So aging was one of the things that came up, but as well as family compositions. You have someone, if you have a teenager, or if you have children, you just have to have different food choice, as well as if you're older parents, you have to cook differently for them. So again, it's not just about the sort of normative Western type of family. It's about intergenerations, different ages as well. So this quote from this paper talked about how this person had to cook a variety for different family members. The third dimension was action-oriented, and this typically refers to how family supports or does value negotiation, different competing, like if there's school fees compared to like buying a certain type of preferred food. So kind of negotiating that, like how do they actively work throughout these various dynamics and various factors. So it particularly talks about how much your family supports. So, whether like with your family, the stigma is particularly related to the HIV context, whether they're very supportive of you as a person. I mean, food is often used as a medium, right? So medium to show support, show kindness. So these were two quotes that particularly stood out in terms of like, if you only have a lot of support, you eat together, there's no stigma, there's no other ways of discriminatory practices. And then the second quote, it talks about how food is used to discriminate and not have family support. So two different scenarios, especially in the HIV context. Stigma is still a persistent issue. And it shows how dietary habits and behaviors form that ultimately affects health outcomes. Next, please. So health context, this is sort of at the bottom. That's kind of shaping and pushing all three dimensions of family dynamics framework. And I put an example about stigmatizing behavior. So we can think about different parts of the health context that's related, whether it's accepted, whether there's sort of like general knowledge of the other family members and like impact on livelihoods. But in a lot of the times in the last 2 decades before there was greater coverage of treatment and adherence, when men would lose their livelihood options, it became a really substantially, like it had a cascade of huge impact on socioeconomic factors. So yes, I saw some questions, Lisa. I'll definitely answer them. But yes, definitely. So when we think about how this could be used, I mean, pretend it's not HIV. Let's think about diabetes or other chronic disease. Like, what are the sort of like knowledge that people have? Well, for hypertension, you might not eat certain foods, or you might have to eat a certain hour. For diabetes, you might have to control a certain level of like glucose. So it's really, there's some knowledge that might be so well known and some association. At least I know from the Indian community, diabetes is just more like, oh, it's like getting old disease. I'm just going to get it. So it's very much accepted as part of life. So there's no prevention, so to speak. So those are the kind of things that really like shape how shape those food choices. Not just for the person having the disease, but also if one person is diagnosed with something in your family, it kind of changes the behavioral habits of others as well. Next slide, please. So starting with the Turner framework, we expanded it to add these sort of three dimensions: family resources, family characteristics, and action-oriented in terms of how they're actively dealing with these issues given the health context. A lot of these factors are they might sound basic, and they are, right? They are very, they're very, they might come in different contexts. Obviously, time use makes sense. Like just thinking about myself, like what my time use is compared to my child's time use, all of these factors play together. What we really wanted to focus on is that family is a very powerful mediator. For example, like the intra-household allocation could really can really have a differential nutrition and dietary outcomes between family members. So it's kind of important to focus on that. And given the rise of non-communicable diseases, just like, among a lot of members of the family, the idea was that when you have this kind of framework, you're focusing both on prevention and treatment. So you have a message, for example, eat less unhealthy food. How does that message look like for teenagers or children versus like old elderly versus like, different adults in the family, given like, where they work and what institutional structures they have. Next slide, please. So the key takeaway is that it's a very important intermediary. It's that's where you really see the interaction between the external and the personal factors, and this we really try to focus on how it enables and binds food choice. So it can really it has the potential to mitigate as well as worsen as well. And we wanted to focus on the more positive side of things. This is a very flexible framework, and I present in the context of HIV, but it's also relevant to other chronic diseases. For example, you could take this framework and try to map out what it would look like in rural West Africa or in urban settings. In urban settings, it's particularly interesting because there's a lot of non-food conditions that really play a role in sort of food choice, and again, that's like, not having enough time, or if you have to spend too much in traffic, or the energy is so expensive, the fuel is so expensive, because in urban areas it's all cash economy. You really have to it really shapes food choice. So there's a lot of non-food conditions in the urban settings that would really shape some of the food choice. So it's very flexible. You could take it and adapt it to different contexts, and also different sort of interventions, like in terms of sustainable, healthy diets. Oh, sorry. I'm almost done. Sustainable healthy diet. For example, you have a message about, for example, reduce meat intake. How would that look for like different members of the family for both treatment as well as prevention? And then lastly, this is a very, typically you see a lot of meta-analysis, meta reviews, and we wanted to really focus on how this is a very useful tool to make use of all the qualitative studies to synthesize, develop, and test existing frameworks. And in the paper, we kind of talk a little bit about the other sort of methods that are useful as well. Next slide, please. One other thing I wanted to mention, sorry, going back to the earlier slide, is that in the context of HIV, there's a lot of frameworks that have family in them. So, for example, there's the interdependence dietetic theory. There's a PEN framework by Evelyn Moore, and then I always mess up the first person's name, Aberin, the PEN model, which talks about like personal, a positive, a negative, neutral perceptions, enablers, personal, extended family, and neighborhood. So there's the elements of family and that interaction and the dynamics in different ways, in different frameworks. So what this framework does is sort of pull it together for the food environment, the food systems. So given all of this is mind, like for the future, as we're thinking about it, especially in the African context, future is urban. We're living in an increasingly urbanized world. That's where everybody is going to lead. Even rural areas are urbanizing. And then we also see climate change, not just floods, but also droughts and extended and chronic. So that needs to be really incorporated into how it affects food choices and family food environments. And then the demographic changes. For example, I mean, African median age is 19 years of age compared to like in the US, it's 38. In the Asia's context, it's 28, 29. So it's really, there's a huge demographic shift that's happening for young people, young women. So this is all going to play a huge role in terms of thinking about how the family food dynamics will change or affect. And there's also high inequality that's going to be increasingly going to have an impact on this. So there is a general sense that the traditional food cultures are appreciated. Increasingly, you're not seeing employment in agriculture that has a lot more higher physical activity. And then this plot that I have here on the right is looking at the food insecurity, even though it's 30% in urban, peri-urban, urban, rural areas, the substantial burden of food insecurity is in urban and peri-urban areas. So also thinking about how this sort of framework could be used given all of these larger macro scale trends that are going would be really important. Next slide, please. I think that should be the last slide. Okay. I'm happy to take questions and comments. I saw really some great comments, questions in the chat. I also want to put a little teaser to our other papers that are out there. One is led by my colleague, Morgan Bonsek. She did a study on drivers of food choice, looking at different levels, extended family and personal levels. And then I also did an analysis on informal food environments and how that affects diets and outcomes. And I'm happy to take question comments, and I think we're going to wait till the end, if I recall. Do you want me to answer the chat questions or just leave them for later?
I think people would benefit from maybe hearing you speak on it broadly in case they don't catch the chat comment, but feel free to, if you want to respond immediately to those, please do. But I think everyone would really benefit from hearing it if we have a chance after the completion of the other presentation.
Sure.
Thank you so much, Ramya. That was an incredibly interesting presentation, and I found the paper to be quite fascinating too. I mean, I think the bottom line is family really is a very powerful mediator, as you said, and it's really, I could tell that there was a lot of work that went into this paper. So thank you again for summarizing that. We will, like Ramya said, go to the next presentation, and then we'll pause briefly to answer questions on both. Charles, are you able to hear us? Pause very quickly to see.
Bon.
Hello.
Ok. Il y a la version anglaise, mais est-ce que tout le monde est confortable avec la version française? On peut aller avec la version française. Allô, est-ce qu'on m'entend?
Yes, we hear you. It's your choice. It's your
Okay.
choice, Charles. Please go ahead.
Ok. Donc, je m'en vais vous présenter le marketing social donc, des aliments nutritifs avec une belle-mère. Ou appeler Maman Lumière. Next. Next slide, please. Ok, le plan de l'exposé, il faut dire que le projet YIDGIRI intervient sur trois zones, donc trois régions. Donc, nous aurons donc la zone d'intervention, le contexte, les grandes étapes. Nous allons aborder une question de sociologie. Nous allons aussi parler de la belle-mère. Comment est-ce qu'on est passé de la belle-mère à la maman lumière? Next. Next slide, please. Voilà, donc les zones d'intervention, comme je le disais, c'est trois régions, 27 communes, la population cible est de 85 000 personnes à atteindre en fin de projet. Il y a trois chaînes de valeur et qui concernent donc le niébé, le petit ruminant, la volaille. Next. Voilà donc résumé donc le projet YIDGIRI. Nous avons les trois chaînes de valeur que nous voyons, donc les petits ruminants, la volaille, le niébé. L'objectif, c'est d'augmenter non seulement
The objective is to increase
les revenus et donc le niveau de vie, d'améliorer donc d'améliorer durablement donc la santé des familles, des ménages. Next. Next slide, please. Ah, ok. Donc, le contexte, la malnutrition au Burkina et dans le monde, il faut dire que nous avons un enfant sur quatre qui souffre de l'état de croissance au Burkina Faso, avec donc une prévalence plus élevée donc, dans les régions du Sahel, 43,1%, dans le centre-nord, 29,8%, et le nord particulièrement. Okay. Alors, les enquêtes SMART donc, qui ont donc produit les grandes étapes de l'approche nutrition développée à YIDGIRI. Nous avons donc l'étude SNET qui nous a permis d'explorer les normes sociales pour dans le cadre donc, de cette étude formative, nous avons pu nous avons donc pu déterminer quels sont qui sont socialement acceptés. Donc, et nous avons pu écarter et explorer les différents interdits alimentaires. Donc, alors, par exemple, les œufs qui ne sont pas consommés, en écoutant la communauté économique que représente le de consommation. Alors, on peut consommer tout autre œuf non fécondé, comme les œufs de poule, par exemple. L'étude aussi nous a montré que les personnes d'influence étaient les belles-mères, les pères, c'est-à-dire les autres femmes, plus ou moins âgées, les personnes âgées et les agents de santé. La plupart donc des aliments dits interdits ont des équivalents qui peuvent être remplacés sans que les consommateurs courent un risque de carence. J'ai donné tantôt l'exemple des œufs. OK. Merci. Next slide, please. Donc, pour revenir sur l'étude, les objectifs donc, de l'étude sur l'exploration des normes sociales qui influencent les habitudes alimentaires, de façon spécifique, il s'agissait de réaliser une revue documentaire pour identifier les aliments nutritifs les moins consommés dans les 3 régions, effectuer une évaluation pour comprendre les normes sociales qui influencent les pratiques alimentaires des ménages et plus particulièrement des femmes et des enfants, pour élaborer donc la stratégie donc, de changement de comportement à partir de l'analyse documentaire et de l'exploration donc, des normes sociales. La finalité, et nous avons comme recommandation, une des recommandations de cette étude a été de mettre en place une école des belles-mères qui sera appelée plus tard les mamans lumière pour mieux les valoriser. Les principaux résultats de cette étude étaient que la femme est influencée par ses pères, elle est influencée par les belles-mères, elle est influencée par les leaders communautaires. Cependant, pour les choix alimentaires, les belles-mères ou les mères avaient la première place devant les autres composantes. Alors, les interdits alimentaires existent et ont des explications non scientifiques, mais des raisons quelquefois économiques qui sont liées à des considérations mystico-rituelles. Alors, les aliments interdits ne peuvent empêcher la couverture des besoins nutritionnels car ils ont des équivalents non interdits. Voici quelques principaux résultats des conclusions que nous avons eues à travers l'exploration des normes sociales qui influencent les habitudes alimentaires. Next slide. Alors, cela nous a permis de comprendre le problème social à résoudre. En effet, la malnutrition est responsable de plusieurs affections qui réduisent les capacités humaines à soutenir les efforts de développement. Le capital humain affecté et la pauvreté est une cause, mais aussi une conséquence. Next slide. Comment résoudre le problème? La stratégie nutrition et changement de comportement nous a amené à identifier 3 comportements clés, comportements ciblés, sur lesquels nous avons travaillé. Le comportement d'achat, c'est-à-dire travailler à ce qu'il y ait plus d'achats alimentaires éclairés. Le comportement de consommation, travailler à ce qu'il y ait plus de consommation d'aliments nutritifs. Et en 3e position, un comportement de production et de vente sur les marchés d'aliments nutritifs et sains. Donc, ce comportement devait aboutir à l'accroissement de la disponibilité locale d'aliments nutritifs et sains. Donc, pour atteindre ce changement de comportement, nous avons élaboré une stratégie qui a été validée en interne et les plans de gestion adaptative qui a été aussi validé avec les collectivités partenaires, les municipalités partenaires. Next slide. Nous allons un peu aborder une question sociologique. Qui est la belle-mère? Donc, un peu de sociologie. Alors, le rôle et la place et la représentation de la belle-mère dans le ménage, dans la société burkinabé. Next slide. Next slide, please. Alors, un peu d'histoire. Donc, dans la plupart des sociétés traditionnelles au Burkina, la belle-mère reste toujours au centre de la socialisation et du renforcement des liens familiaux au niveau des ménages. Elle a pour charge d'initier la jeune femme dans les affaires du ménage, une sorte de mémoire vivante pour transmettre l'histoire, les valeurs d'une femme de bonne famille. En effet, la belle-mère joue un rôle clé dans la transmission du savoir traditionnel. Elle donne souvent des conseils à sa belle-fille sur la gestion du foyer, les soins à apporter au nouveau-né, etc. Elle peut susciter des influences parfois positives ou négatives sur les comportements des jeunes mères ou des jeunes femmes en âge de procréer, compte tenu de son statut de personne âgée, ayant une solide expérience et dotée d'une certaine morale. Elle construit le lien entre la famille du père et celle de l'enfant, devenu chef de famille. Elle joue le rôle donc de conservatrice du savoir-faire et du savoir-être de la famille. Elle peut aussi être source de tension lorsque les intérêts de la jeune femme, donc la jeune fille, la belle-fille, se heurtent donc à la sienne, à ses intérêts. Du fait de leur expérience vécue, par exemple, la belle-mère peut facilement orienter la belle-fille dès les premiers signes de la grossesse et l'assister jusqu'à l'accouchement. Elles sont celles qui vont communiquer les interdits et les totems alimentaires à la jeune femme nouvellement mariée, considérée le plus souvent comme une étrangère à initier dans la vie de famille de son mari pour perpétuer l'harmonie dans son environnement familial. Toutefois, cette assistance n'est pas à vie. Elle prend fin lorsque la jeune femme devient autonome sur ce point. Next slide. Next slide. Alors, nous allons parler maintenant comment est-ce qu'on arrive à la maman lumière à partir des belles-mères. De la belle-mère à la maman lumière. Critères. Les critères donc pour être désigné maman lumière, c'était d'abord d'être une femme de la communauté, être membre d'une coopérative de production donc, au sein donc, des 3 chaînes de valeur, avoir ou eu au moins un enfant à sa charge, c'est-à-dire avoir l'expérience de l'alimentation et des pratiques de soins, avoir au moins 29 ans, avoir le désir de s'engager pour le bien-être de sa communauté, être volontaire et disponible, vouloir soit associer à la sensibilisation une AGR dans un souci de durabilité. Savoir lire et écrire dans sa langue ou en français a été un atout. Next slide. Qu'est-ce qui les a motivés? Pourquoi elles s'engagent? Elles le font pour agir en faveur de leur communauté, pour promouvoir la consommation des aliments locaux, pour informer le plus grand nombre sur les vertus des aliments nutritifs, pour une meilleure nutrition et avoir des retombées sur la santé. Elles le font aussi pour gagner des revenus à partir de la vente de leurs produits nutritifs. Nous avons pu identifier 560 hommes et femmes qui ont été formés et parmi ces 560 hommes et femmes, 62% se sont engagés à être des mamans lumière ou des papas lumière. Next slide. Alors, il faut dire que dans le projet, il y a 2 approches voilà, qui ont été mises en œuvre dans YIDGIRI. Le marketing commercial et le marketing social. Le marketing commercial, c'est ça se fait donc à partir des unités de transformation, voilà, des produits formulés ou non. Et ce marketing est associé au marketing social qui se fait avec les mamans lumière et les mères leaders, donc au niveau communautaire. Pourquoi et c'est quoi le marketing social dans YIDGIRI? Next slide. Next slide, please. Nous allons passer sur cette slide pour gagner un temps. Next slide. Next slide, please. OK, je vais commenter la slide d'abord. Il y a deux approches dans notre intervention. OK, merci. Le marketing social, donc, dans la nutrition, elle a consisté d'abord à développer une approche pour influencer les comportements qui profitent aux individus et aux communautés, le plus grand bien social en faveur de la consommation d'aliments nutritifs et sains. Les principes clés, le cœur du marketing social et son orientation vers la communauté nous a permis d'écouter les personnes dont nous souhaitons modifier le comportement pour comprendre ce qu'elles veulent et pourquoi elles font ce qu'elles font. Next slide. Les, les 8 produits qui ont été donc ciblés pour combler donc les carences alimentaires sont donc les feuilles vertes foncées, le niébé et ses dérivés, le lait et ses dérivés, la viande de volaille, les œufs de poule pondeuse, la viande de petits ruminants, la patate douce à chair orange, le petit poisson séché. Next slide. Alors, la stratégie de nutrition complémentaire, il s'agissait de réduire l'utilisation de produits chimiques par la conservation et faire proposer par les transformateurs des produits, des formats adaptés avec des emballages appropriés, réduire les contraintes liées aux travaux ménagers en faisant proposer par les unités de transformation des produits prêts à l'emploi, pré-cuits, transformés, réduisant la charge de travail domestique. Ce sont ces produits que les mamans lumière vont utiliser pour promouvoir donc la consommation saine des aliments. Donc, et nous avons aussi travaillé pour promouvoir l'autoconsommation dans les chaînes de valeur et la répartition judicieuse des revenus au profit donc de la bonne nutrition à travers les sensibilisations. Il s'agit aussi de mettre en place une plateforme donc de Maman Lumière, ce qui a été fait, l'animer et la stimuler. Il s'agissait aussi d'accroître les mises en relation commerciale pour améliorer la disponibilité et l'accessibilité des aliments nutritifs sur le marché alimentaire. Next slide. Donc, nous allons maintenant nous aborder la journée modèle d'une maman lumière. Comment est-ce que les mamans lumière contribuent au changement social? C'est l'histoire donc de Abibou Soré, une maman lumière modèle. Nous pouvons cliquer le lien pour avoir la vidéo. OK, nous pouvons... Nous pouvons peut-être poursuivre, après nous allons revenir sur la vidéo. Next slide. Voilà, ici nous avons donc des activités donc de Maman Lumière. Alors, la première image, nous voyons de Maman Lumière en train d'organiser une démonstration culinaire de farine infantile, donc qu'elles ont appris à fabriquer pour donc combler les carences alimentaires des enfants les enfants donc de 0 à 2 ans. Donc, qui concernent les 1000 jours d'opportunités pour améliorer la nutrition. Nous avons en deuxième image une causerie dans un ménage où la maman lumière est en train de s'entretenir avec plusieurs groupes de femmes, les femmes allaitantes et des femmes qui sont en âge de procréer. Et on a un monsieur aussi qui suit, donc c'est causerie. Next slide. Nous avons ici donc une promotion, c'est des journées promotionnelles qui sont organisées pour voir les aliments nutritifs. Et nous avons l'accompagnement donc des mamans lumière lors de ces journées promotionnelles. Next slide. Alors, pour résumer, en termes d'impact, pour les mamans lumière, la diffusion donc des aliments nutritifs à travers les points de vente a été facilitée par l'action des mamans lumière qui, au niveau donc des activités promotionnelles, font le lien entre les points de distribution et les consommateurs ou entre les points de distribution et les transformateurs. Donc, nous avons aussi la distribution dans des aliments nutritifs de proximité, de porte à porte, dans les quartiers et les villages. Nous avons l'appui aux animations et les démonstrations culinaires lors des journées promotionnelles. Et nous pouvons à ce jour comptabiliser pour les 2 mois passés seulement 2 millions de ventes générées par les AGR, donc des mamans lumière. Il faut dire que les mamans lumière que nous suivons sont au nombre de 100. Nous comptons intensifier cette activité. Près de 3000 personnes ont été touchées en 1 mois par les sensibilisations donc, de ces mamans lumière. Next slide. Nous avons ici la fiche diversification qui a été utilisée, qui est utilisée par les mamans lumière. Nous voyons les 3 groupes d'aliments donc, qui sont donc conseillés. Et ces 3 groupes d'aliments sont répartis pour tenir compte des 10 groupes de consommation. De façon pédagogique, il a été très longtemps enseigné qu'il faut consommer 3 groupes, sauf qu'il faut atteindre les 5 groupes en fin de journée, ce qui nous a permis d'adapter l'outil pour expliquer qu'à l'intérieur des 3 groupes, il y a des sous-groupes qu'il faut considérer et varier à l'intérieur des sous-groupes pour atteindre les 5 groupes en fin de journée. Slide. Next slide, please. Les mamans lumière sont aussi dotées par d'autres outils qui sont donc des outils de sensibilisation ciblés, personnalisés. Donc, nous avons l'outil pour les mères enceintes, les femmes enceintes, l'outil pour les femmes allaitantes, l'outil pour les enfants et les hommes, les personnes âgées. Next slide. Et enfin, nous avons donc la fiche qui concerne les femmes en âge de procréer. Et cette affiche-là permet, toutes ces 4 affiches permettent aux mamans lumière d'adresser des messages précis à des groupes spécifiques précis et nous pouvons enfin savoir si effectivement ces mamans lumière ont atteint les différentes cibles qui constituent donc leur communauté. Donc, nous pouvons dire que le besoin de couvrir les 1000 jours de la fenêtre d'opportunité nous amène à prendre en compte même les jeunes femmes en âge de procréer dans les sessions de sensibilisation. Cela permet de corriger les carences alimentaires chez la future mère avant la conception de l'enfant. Il faut dire que les mamans lumière, en utilisant ces outils, créent la demande de consommation en aliments nutritifs et elles proposent en même temps des aliments qui ont été formulés par des unités de transformation, qui ont été formés par YIDGIRI pour proposer des aliments adaptés, des aliments à coût réduit et des aliments qui couvrent les besoins. Et c'est ce qui fait qu'elles ont l'activité de sensibilisation et l'activité génératrice de revenus. Enfin, les conditions pour réussir l'approche Maman Lumière, il faut l'engagement pour la cause communautaire, il faut la disponibilité des acteurs et il faut les retombées visibles. Next slide.
Oh, yeah, thank you so much, Charles. This was wonderful and so innovative and exciting. We'll be sure to send out the slides and the video to everybody. I'll turn it back to Neha for wrapping up today. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Charles, for votre présentation. Thank you so much for the presentation. That was incredibly interesting. I know we have come close to the end. Does anyone have any questions in the last few minutes we have? And perhaps we can follow up with those who share any questions in the chat that we're not able to get to today. But in our last minutes, please do ask anything you might have.
Maybe Ramya, we'd love to hear more about the gender and age dynamic.
Yeah, that was a great question. Thank you. It was a very persistent, theme, and it wasn't just the gender of the person with HIV, which also affected, like whether they get it, whether the type of food choice and how it shaped the food choice, but it was also the gender of the caregiver, the primary caregiver of the PLHIV. In the context of men, it was primarily because of the livelihood. It was very much tied to the economic reasons. And there was a lot of social aspects as well. So I think, and it wasn't always negative towards women. There were some where, like, the woman lost her husband and she would move to her in-laws. Their in-laws were supportive of her and her children. So it wasn't sort of like there were some contrasting things where, like, there were positive support as well for the women. Yeah, gender is a persistent theme, especially I think I mentioned in the chat that the nutrition transition, if you really look at it, it's a gender nutrition transition. Like, it's when women start working outside the home, their time use changes, and the amount you have for preparing, like processing, all these things change, right? So again, there's a big shift that happens, especially depending on the stage of HIV diagnosis and treatment. So it's really, it's a persistent theme, whether it's HIV or not, both from a caregiving end, but also from a comorbidity perspective. I hope that answers the question.
Yes, thank you. And Stephanie, do you want to wrap us up?
Sure. Thanks, everybody, so much for joining. Thank you, Charles. Thank you, Ramya. Your presentations really highlighted how important it is to think about families when we're thinking about food systems and the food environment. We just wanted to share these QR codes. If you want to learn more about our community of practice, and if you haven't joined our community of practice but would like to be a member, we also have a link for that here. If you have any experiences, either programmatic or research findings that you'd like to share through this community of practice, we'd love to hear from you. So please feel free to contact me. I'll stick my email in the chat, or when you register for the Find COP, there's also a way that you can let us know that you'd like to present. And we'll be sharing links related to this presentation, as well as the recording of this presentation, out over email in the next day or so. Thank you all so much for joining, and thank you again, Charles and Ramya.
Merci, merci. N'oubliez pas aussi la vidéo, on peut partager la vidéo qu'on a partagée. Les gens aient des avis. Merci.
Yes, we'll be sure to share that over email as well. Thank you again, everyone.
Le bazar, regarde la dame là, comment elle est.